And I want to read that verse that was just read again, Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. Very, very familiar passage. Sometimes too familiar. And we read over it and we take it for granted. And I've titled this Sacrifice of Worship. And the passage reads, and I'm reading from the English Standard Version, I appeal to you, therefore. So whenever we're in class, which will be starting tomorrow in chapel, whenever we're in class, the therefore means something came before it. that on the ground of that, this. So I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So there's our passage, and we'll let it sit there. And I want to read this very familiar story as kind of an illustration or a benchmark for this, because it's one we're all very familiar with. That there's a caterpillar named Chris. It once felt like a worm, small, slow, and insecure. Leaves seemed too big, branches too far, and every breeze felt like it might knock him off his path. Still, he kept moving, not knowing exactly why. One night, Chris felt a tug inside himself, a sense that something needed to change. So he wrapped himself in a cocoon, not out of fear, but out of hope. In that stillness, he discovered that transformation isn't loud or dramatic. It's patient. It's uncomfortable. It's the kind of work no one sees. When he finally emerged, he wasn't the same creature who had crawled in. He stretched out new wings, shimmering with colors he never knew he carried. The branches that once seemed impossible were suddenly within reach. The breeze that once threatened him now lifted him even higher. He didn't become a butterfly because he wanted to be beautiful. He became one because he dared to grow. His name is now Christian. If you ever feel like you're stuck in your own cocoon, remember it's not a prison, it's a beginning. We love that story, the metamorphosis. And I think it's one of God's greatest examples in nature to us. It's not just metamorphosis, it's a metaphor for a new life. I said we're just to give you a point of reference, I'm preaching through what we're going to study through a workbook in the fall called The Journey. And so this just happens to be, we looked at last week, Ephesians 4:13, the goal, right? So we said that transformation is never a solo project. It's together. We grow together, we grow deeper, stronger into Christ, which is the standard and the goal. We have this acronym in the motivational world, right? TEAM. The acronym for TEAM is together, everybody achieves more. And that kind of sums up our life together, this transformation journey. I want to just put this, because we're going to look at this contrast between passive and active approach to life. In the context of what I have titled being good stewards of God's grace, Peter says this in 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 3 and 4. He says, "For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. With respect to this, they are surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you." So that's the backdrop. That's Peter. Now, I often said Peter, he's a good example for me. We need mentors, we need examples in our life, and I identify mostly with Peter. I call him, when we're in class, I call him the rogue fisherman, because I was a mechanic, I was in the trades, and where we work hard and we play hard, and it seems like that was Peter's past. He wasn't, I wanted to say in our class this morning as we're going through Acts also is going to, if we're following along, is going to give us a contrast between Peter and his transformation and then Paul and his transformation, because Peter, his background is the rogue fisherman, the working bootstrap. If you want something done right, you do it yourself. Versus Paul, who's going to be the educated. He is the elite. He is the sophisticated one. And both of them had to be humble and convert, and that's their conversion stories. But anyway, it's transformation, and it's not easy. And we remark often at what those early apostles had to go through and endure from the people they loved the most. Why would you do this? Why would you bring this upon yourself? It's hard to understand. And from, one of my mentors in business, his favorite saying was, "It's just everything." Yeah, it's just everything. So from this text, I want to give you the background. I want to give you the contrast, why we get to Paul being able to say this in Romans 12:1, that we're to present our bodies as a living sacrifice. First of all, let's go to what the Hebrew writers were explaining to the Hebrews in chapter 9. Hebrews chapter 9 is explaining to what we call the Jewish Christians of the day, making sure they understand the transition from this physical kingdom to the spiritual kingdom. And so they're presented with this. So you need to understand the sacrificial system at its core to understand the way Paul's going to set this up in Romans. And so I'm not going to go through all of Hebrews, because you really could, because Paul, when he starts an idea, he just runs with it for chapters on end. So I'm going to isolate it down and try to give you this snapshot view. In Hebrews 9, verses 22 through 28, so he's talking to the Jews who understand the sacrificial system. Well, what the heck is that? That is, he says, "Indeed, under the law," and he's talking about the law of Moses. During the law of Moses, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. So Paul also explained this in the beginning of the Roman letter, that there is a law that men are subject to. It's called the law of sin and death. And basically, to simplify it in its most simplest terms, you sin, you die. The wages of sin is death. The law came along and said, here's a remedy, here's a covering for your sin. You sin, blood still needs to be shed, so you understand the severity of sin. When you sin, death occurs. That's the law of sin and death. So they were given this physical illustration, and they erected this tent under the law of Moses. This tent, we call it the tabernacle in the wilderness, when they first constructed this after they received the law of Mount Sinai, and then they erected this temple, tabernacle where the sin would be dealt with. And so verse 23 of Hebrews 9 says, thus it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ has entered not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly as the high priest enters the holy places year after year with blood not his own, for then he would have had to suffer repeatedly from the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And just as his, forgive me, my tongue's not working well this morning. Just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. I'm going to blame this on the allergy season. Forgive me. So let's go. So there's the law of sin and death. You sin, you die. Israel was given a system that was ministered by the Levitical tribe. And so they had this system. But we're usually familiar with the Day of Atonement, that once a year sacrifice where the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies and he makes the Day of Atonement and covers all the sin for all of Israel. And so, but the idea remains, there is a sacrifice for sin. So in Romans chapter 12, when Paul gets to the therefore I appeal to you, he had just laid out, so chapters 9 through 11 now, Paul makes this kind of appeal, because remember, this Roman letter was delivered to the church to help usher in the new kingdom. Oh, I should have said it. So, to usher in this new kingdom, they need unity. You have what we call, in the early church, we had this Jew and Gentile friction. It was highlighted here in Rome because there was a time when the Jews were expelled from Rome, so the Gentiles were left on their own, and they were doing pretty good. They probably thought they were doing pretty good. And apparently when the Jewish Christians came back, they have some friction. Kind of like we were talking this morning in our Bible study. It's like, well, we know stuff. We have standing. And Paul basically has to, forgive me, I'm going to use the term boot camp. All right? I said camp. And Chelsea's like, well, it's not really a camp, but camp, right? Anytime you're going to learn something, like we talked about going into a cocoon for a while. I mean, if we're going to rehab, we need to be isolated for a while. We need to just, I think if you're at camp, Chelsea, you eat, sleep, drink, right? It's all about this, right? This is what we do. And why do we do that? Because for a period of time, it builds up the muscle memory, all the stuff that we need, the fundamentals. And then it helps us when we leave the camp, we go back and we can tune out the noise, right? And now we can apply what we learn. So Paul's trying to unify this group and reminds them at the beginning of this letter that all have sinned and all fall short of the glory of God. Nobody has standing. So we're not going to have unity if we're vying for supremacy, which is our human nature to do. Maybe with good intentions, but But he gets to this point where in chapter 9, he says, listen, I would cut myself off from Christ if I knew that would save my countrymen who just cannot see Christ because this veil is covering them. And so he's going through this whole thing about how the Jews had all the promises and all of that. And he gets to chapter 11 and he sums it up this way. And I'm just going to kind of go through, survey chapter 11 in Romans. He says, I asked then, has God rejected his people? So he's talking about those Jews who have not come to Christ. He says, has God rejected them? By no means. He says, for I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Do you not know what the scripture says of Elijah, how he appeals to God against Israel? So Israel deserved coming against them. But remember, this is 11:3. Elijah says, Lord, they have killed your prophets, they have demolished your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what is God's reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too at this present time there is a remnant chosen by God. But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works, otherwise grace would no longer be grace. What then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened. Now follow. This is, as when we were going through, I love going through Romans, this is one of these cases where Paul, in the midst of his explanation, can't help but break out into prayer because this revelation is so revealing. It's like, oh my goodness, can you believe this? He said, listen, they were hardened. As it is written, verse 8, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see, ears that would not hear, down to this very day. And David says, let their table be a snare and a trap, a stumbling block, and a retribution for them. Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see and bend their backs forever. Now he says, so I asked, verse 11, so I asked, did they stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles so as to make Israel jealous. And here's where this stuff's starting to, like I say, I get something that's hard for me to understand. It rolls around in my head for a while. And Paul's the learned one, right, of the two between Peter and Paul. And he's like, how do we make sense of this? Verse 12, now if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? Now I'm speaking to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry. And what he's saying there is, I'm bringing in a harvest of Gentiles. That's what it means to magnify, so as to make them jealous. It's like, hey, we're moving on. In order, verse 14, that my fellow Jews might be jealous and thus save some of them. For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so the whole is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among others and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. If you are, remember it is not you who support the root, but the root supports you. See, I think he's appealing to our human nature, right? Our human nature is we We get knowledge, and then we said knowledge is power, and then we want to use that power over it. He said, don't be so arrogant about this, okay? Then you will say, verse 19, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief. But you stand fast through faith. So do not become proud, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Note then the kindness and severity of God. Severity. We were just talking about this morning in our class. The kindness and severity. And we had the severity of Ananias and Sapphira. So, right, the kindness and the severity. We said, well, I don't really understand this. Well, listen, he says, provided you continue in his kindness, otherwise you too will be cut off. Verse 23, and even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again. For as you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted contrary to nature, cultivated into the olive tree, how much more will these natural branches be grafted back into their own olive tree? So and here's where he says, now listen, lest you be wise in your own eyes. Okay, verse 25. I want you to understand this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved, as it is written. The deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob. And thus will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. As regard to the gospel, they are enemies of God for your sake, but as regards of election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. For just as you were at one time disobedient to God, but now have received mercy because of their disobedience, so they too now have been disobedient, in order that by the mercy shown to you, they also may receive mercy. For God has consigned all to disobedience, that they may have mercy on all, or he may have mercy on all. Oh, and this is where he said, oh, the depths and the riches and wisdom of the knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments, how inscrutable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor, or who has given him a gift that he deserves to be repaid? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory and glory forever. And he just can't help but praise and pray to God over that. This is amazing. I wouldn't have thought of this. How is God going to reconcile the world to him? How is he going to deal with us, with our silly pettiness, right? This is how. On that ground, I appeal to you, brothers, therefore, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice. What was the acceptable sacrifice under the law? Holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. So, how in the world do we do this? How do we even make sense of this? So, Christ becomes our sacrifice. He sacrificed himself once for all, and that takes care of our sin. How do we deal with that now? Paul says, sacrifice yourself. How do we do this? 12:2. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good, acceptable, and perfect. So here's the contrast. Do not be conformed to this world. That's passive. We live in this life. We grow up in this life. Chelsea, forgive me for picking on you, and I'm not picking on you. But what we do in the example, because Chelsea's stealing my heart with what she's doing. And so you pick up everybody else's habits. And then you go to camp and they say, you can't do that. And we're going to work on that. We're going to go back to the fundamentals. But that's what it means to be conformed to the world. Most of us don't choose the values and the guiding principles, our philosophy in our life. We live in the world and we pick and choose. That seems good. I'm going to try this for a while. And that was a dumb idea. I'm going to switch. I'm going to try this for a while. This person seems to. This is why podcasters, bloggers, paid ads, why they're always going to be the rage, right? Because anytime somebody has any little bit of success, everybody's, how'd you do that? And now I want to do that. It's funny, again, right? You go to like the pro. I like this in the ring, right? They asked the prize fighter, how he won that fight. It's like, wow, that's just amazing. And he says, well, it didn't happen in the ring. It happened in the preparation. So they asked the guy, he hits the winning shot in the golf tournament. And they say, I wish I could play like, somebody in the crowd says, I wish I could play like that. And he turns to me and says, no, you don't. I said, what? No, you don't. Because what you want is this glory in the spotlight, hitting the winning shot. What you won't do is get up early every morning and shoot till your hands blister. You won't put the prep in. You won't put the time in. But you want the glory. And that's the idea of that caterpillar going into the cocoon, is to isolate yourself for a while and get those fundamentals down and put to death. So that's the language that's used here. So the contrast is to don't be conformed to this world, which is you keep accepting a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and then I do that for a while. He said, no. Be transformed. And transformation, we've already said, is a process by the renewing of your mind. So now I have to look at things differently. This is the standard, and this is a good standard. Like we were reading in John 10 this week. I am the good shepherd, Jesus says. I am the good shepherd. Good. Don't call anybody good but God. Shepherd. I'm the leader of the flock. And those who hear my voice follow me. And so we have a standard to follow. But being transformed is being a process so we could test these things. And we're told to test everything. I'll give you a little for study if you want. 2 Peter chapter 2, because many false prophets have gone out. And there are people in the congregations that are, I don't know, intentionally, unintentionally, it doesn't really matter. We need to be mature and growing up and test everything. We have the word. We don't have excuses. So, but what does Paul say? Well, let me go back to Peter now. In this context, Peter says in 1 Peter 3:18, for Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. Do we know that? As Christians, we know that. He rose. Why did Jesus resurrect? Why did he rise from the dead? Because he didn't sin. He passed the test. And God demonstrated that the resurrection not only is the new life that Jesus was saying, follow me and you'll live forever like me. He conquered death, that death isn't the final answer now, and proved it to us. So we know we can follow him. So in Romans 8:13, so Paul would say, if you live according to the flesh, you will die. That's the law of sin and death. You sin, you die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. And this is what I say is walking in the light. This is not perfection. This is direction. This is why the journey matters. This is why we fellowship. This is why we come together. Because we do a really good job, as we talked about in study this morning, right? We do a good job of beating our own selves up. Oh, I just beat myself up every time. I shouldn't have done that. Why did I do it that way? But if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we're not self-condemned all the time. We're living in the light. But Paul would say in Colossians 3:5, put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. We mentioned Galatians 5, the contrasting list. Good. But if we say, well, I can never do that, or it's my nature, or I keep trying and I can't do it. If we don't even know what the standard is, we have no hope. And there should be a good amount of fear that we don't want to backslide because we said, well, I just didn't know, or I just can't do this, or you don't know me, I can never change that. That may be true. You may spend a whole life and never overcome that. But don't walk away from the light. He says if you walk in the light, you're covered. So it's not, the goal here is not to be self-righteous, but sanctified. We don't make ourselves holy. That word just means to be holy. So when he says, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable, we don't make ourselves holy. We strive to live holy because we bear his name, Christian. And as long as we bear his name, he sees us as holy. That is the good news. That is how, by the way, forgive me, I did it again. That is how all Israel is saved. By the gospel. Because anyone who did not obey was cut off. It was our memory verse in Acts when they quote Deuteronomy 18. Moses said, the Lord your God's going to raise up for you a prophet like me from among your brothers. And when he does, you must listen to him. And everyone who doesn't listen to that prophet will be cut off. That's how God purifies his people. And that's how all Israel will be saved. And that's why it's always been a remnant. And it's true today. Because the path is narrow. And you have to diligently seek him. But the gospel is open to all who open up their heart and say, yes, I want to follow. Let me give it to you this way. 8:14. 8:14 through 18. This is it. We'll end it here. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. For you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God, and if children, then heirs. Heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him in order that we may be glorified with him. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. There's coming a time in our life where we have to, we say, yes, I want to obey the gospel and I want to be baptized, and we have an invitation, and if the gospel hits you, today's the day, you hear his voice, you want to obey the gospel. But that's a beginning of our obedience. But what we end up doing is we say, yes, I'm in, and then when we get under pressure, we revert back to what we know, and then we start engaging in this process. And at some time, at some point in our walk, we're going to have to say, you know what? I really need to take this seriously. I need to go into a cocoon I need to surround myself. I need to start looking at my associations, right? We'd say in business, right, if you keep doing what you're doing, you're going to keep getting what you're getting. Why do I keep doing this? Maybe it's time to look at those associations. But that doesn't happen right away. That takes time. Choose I would say, choose your mentors wisely, right? And we have that, but we have the word to always come back to. But what a great picture. And I just want to leave you with this. It's that do not be conformed, be transformed. The contrast is conformity is like that mob. Wherever the mob's going, I kind of follow that. I did it again. But transform is knowing the right thing and standing your ground. Conformity sometimes like, yeah, I might know the right thing, but I'm going to do what everybody else does. Maturity is growing up in that. And guess what, brothers and sisters? As we fellowship together, as we do this, people are watching you. And as you grow, it gives them inspiration and helps them along the way. If we don't ever try, and it's not to be self-righteous, but if we don't ever try to be holy, we're not walking in the light. So we have an invitation song. If it touches you, we're here.